Muhammad, and the date is June 14th, 2021. And this will be the first interview for my story.
In all of your years, how would you summarize life?
A journey.
A journey.
Life is a journey from cradle to the grave. It's been interesting. It has its ups and downs and its adventures. Well, looking back, I would have to say the most fulfilling part of the journey has been that place where I finally accepted Islam and embarked on a new life compared to what I had been living up to that point. I guess I can start at the very beginning. I was born in 1952 in Kingston, Jamaica, and I was given the name Mercedes Carmelina.
Mercedes Carmelita.
Actually, it was Mercedes because we have a hint of the Cuban background of my mother and my grandparents with the name, both names, Mercedes and Carmelina. So I came into the world with that.
All right, and this was in
And then in Kingston, Jamaica,
And the year was?
1952.
1952, Kingston, Jamaica. All right. And you hinted about your Cuban background. Can you expound a
Well,
little
it's
bit?
not my Cuban background because I never went to Cuba, was never a part of that. But that's my mother and my grandparents. That's where that came from. Cuba being 90 miles from Jamaica and a thriving economy at the time. Many Jamaicans migrated to Cuba for work and things of that nature. So they were among that wave of migration. Of course, when Batista was overthrown, everybody came back. Well, not everybody. Most people came back home.
Okay.
I had an aunt who returned to Cuba, and we never saw or heard from her again. My mother was born in Cuba.
Okay.
My father was born in Jamaica.
So how long were your grandparents in?
I don't know how long they were there. I know they lived and worked there for some years, during which time my mother was born. And then
But-
they returned to the island. Actually, I think my mother and her older sister were both born in Havana.
Oh yes,
Both of
both
my
of your grandparents
were
migrated
originally yes.
from Jamaica.
They went
to-
they went to Havana to work. I think the job opportunities were good there because of the economy.
Okay. So you grow up into this household. Now you're born into this household. Tell us briefly about that household, what it comprised of, and what kind of atmosphere you came into.
My early childhood was, I guess, until around the age of 9 when my mother migrated, was in that house, and the house my grandfather built, and it was an idyllic childhood as far as my experiences were concerned. But of course, being an only child, it had its advantages and disadvantages.
So you were born into your grandfather's house, right? So you lived with your grandfather, your
By
grandmother.
this time, no. By the time I was born, my grandfather had passed away.
Okay.
I never met my grandfather. I don't know him. Just heard about him.
So you lived with your grandmother.
Somewhat, my step grandmother,
Okay. So
Because
this
this is my
house
mother's
is
stepmother.
this house is number 3
Johnson Terrace.
Johnson Terrace. So number 3 Johnson Terrace. When you were born into that house, so obviously your mother lived there, and your grandmother lived there.
My mother and her father and her stepmother were the ones who inhabited that home. Later on, the house was converted. I guess after his death, the house was converted to rental portions. So luckily for me, family members came to live in the house who had children, and so I had children to play with. And,
So who were the family members that you lived in the house with?
well, my cousins came to live in the house.
And those were
That's what
whose
you're talking
kids?
These were the Davises, my father's cousin and his wife and children.
Okay.
They came to live in the house, and
All right.
consequently I grew up with those children for a portion of my life.
Okay. So tell me about your extended network. So you had your grandmother, who, what's her situation? Because you're hinting that she's not living with you at the house. Where is she in the picture at this point?
My maternal grandmother is living in her own house. My mother grows up with her father and her stepmother.
Okay. So you're
So this is where she grew up and she lived.
with your father.
And my
your-
grandmother, my maternal grandmother, she lived elsewhere with her other children.
Okay, so your maternal grandmother and your maternal
Maternal
grandfather,
grandfather
they separated.
Yes.
All right, so now you had two grand
No.
homes to go to. You had your grandmother,
And
you
the home
grew
my
up and your
grandfather,
grandfather lived in.
Mhm.
Okay, so tell me about. So you have your grandmother, and your grandfather. So I'm assuming they have different sets of children.
My
Or-
grandmother,
Mm.
yes. My grandfather, no. My mother was the only child of my grandfather.
Your grandmother's siblings would come from your mother.
My her mother's
Her mother's
side. Exactly.
And how many siblings? So
And there were the older sister that I mentioned and returned to Cuba.
Mm-hmm. Hold that thought.
So there are, the one in Cuba and my mom, those are the two oldest. Then there is Evelyn, then there is Margaret and Jean.
And that's a
So
total of.
she had 5 daughters, my grandmother, and 1 son. The son was older than, he was the oldest.
Oh, whatever
And
happened to
he had
him?
passed away by the time. I just heard of him. I never met him. Just like I never met,
The other
yes, the older sister.
what's her name?
Gertrude.
Gertrude. So
We
Your
refer to her as
father-
Aunt Tintin. Tintin. Okay, no. She had 1 boy and the 5 girls.
and what was his name?
Oscar.
So you had Oscar, you had
Gertrude,
Aunt Tintin, and
my mother,
okay.
Aunt Evelyn.
Wait, but your mother was. So your father had a different wife before your grandmother.
My father Never
Your
married
grandfather.
anybody before.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Your
My
grandfather.
grandfather, no, she was after my mother was born.
So he had two elder siblings. Your mother had two elder siblings.
Yes.
Who were
Well,
they
my
from?
mother's, by her mother.
By her mother. So she had another husband before she married.
Yes, yes.
Before she married, and what's his name? Your father?
My grandfather, Reuben.
Reuben.
My
So
grandmother is Louise.
so Louise marries someone else, has two kids, and then she marries Reuben,
Reuben.
and has
My mother.
Iris. Okay, and then
There is Evelyn, Margaret, and Jean.
and those are all from your
And
stepdad.
The next, yes.
All right. Or your step grand. You seem like you're gonna have a lot of steps in your life.
A lot of steps.
That's the Jamaican way, right?
Absolutely.
All right. So now you have. So at this point, you have the four aunties and your grandmother, right? That are still in Jamaica with you, and that's from your mother's side of the family, and they're living where?
Actually, I don't have four aunties. I only have two.
Because the other one's in England.
Actually, three. Three. The one who migrates to England, she left. I was about 7 years old.
Okay.
So I know her.
Okay.
And I know her first son. I remember him. So I knew her, Evelyn, and I knew Margaret, and I knew Jean.
Mm-hmm.
Those were my three aunts that I knew. The elder one I didn't know, and the uncle, just stories.
Okay. All right. So you had. So you had the three aunties there at least until you're 7. And they
much older. 7 was when Evelyn
Evelyn. So
immigrated to.
how was the relationship between you all at this point?
It was close. It has always been close because my mother, as the older sister, both her younger sisters, her being the oldest sister there, the younger ones always gravitated towards her, always looked up to her, particularly my Aunt Margaret.
Mm-hmm.
She was very close to my mother.
Okay. And what was the proximity of your living space? Because she was with her father, right?
Oh, that was
It was.
worlds apart. It was worlds apart. My mother lived on the east side of Kingston,
Mm-hmm.
and my grandmother lived on the west side of Kingston, and these were worlds apart.
How were their
Different
relationships?
communities altogether. My mother and my grandmother,
Mm-hmm.
it was good. It was very good. She was always well received, and she was always anxious to go. And she visited her. We had regular Sunday visits.
Mm-hmm.
We would go to visit, my grandmother.
Mm-hmm.
And
was it like a car drive, or was it like a pack all your bags,
was
let's
an
hike across town on a cab?
It was an interesting bus ride. It was more than one bus because we had to take the bus to town, to the city, to the center of town, the center of Kingston, and then we would change the bus that went to our side of town and get the bus that went to her side of town. And yeah, and it was very interesting. Those bus rides were when I saw the differences in the Jamaican society and, people and how everyone lived and things that were your glimpses of things like Rastafarians and co-religions like the Pocomania and things like that these were the times that I saw these things on this bus ride, particularly the second leg when we got on the bus to go to my grandmother's house from the center of town.
Mm.
Oh,
So,
that was always an eventful ride.
so where you live, where your grandfather's house was, that was at that point the better part of Kingston,
Yes.
or was that like what the Red Hills are today?
Um, a little like the hills, but of course, Red Hills was not developed at that time.
Right.
It was a little later on that they started building more and moving out. You know, people in this area would go out and get houses there. But for the most part, it was very different. So when you actually start cutting, you know where to cut back.
Whoops. Alright, you're gonna take that back. Alright. So grandma's house. Alright, so now you're going through the city, it's your Sunday and you get dressed up.
Yeah, we get
and
dressed up.
I'm assuming that this is all taking place and you go to your grandmother's
get dressed up
house.
and go over to my grandmother's house.
Okay.
Where my mother spends some time with her and take her something and then we'll.
Well, I would imagine that there was some good eating at this point.
Oh yeah.
What are some of your fondest memories of your grandmother?
My grandmother, she was very interesting. I think if I could go back and talk to her now, I would learn more of her knowledge of herbs. She had a bunch of stuff that she grew in pots all around her yard. And whenever someone was ill, she knew which pot to go to for which little thing she was growing and give them. I remember if I had a cold, she had something growing that she called leaf of life. And it was succulent. It was a succulent green leaf, similar to maybe a cactus leaf. And she would wrap it in a cheesecloth and she would pound it and squeeze the cheesecloth out. And this green liquid would come spewing out. And I'm looking, and this is what I was given.
Was it good?
No. And I think, if I remember correctly, I think she used to sprinkle a little bit of salt in it. And she would give this, you would have to drink. But fast forward, I now, as an adult, later on when I come to America and you're hearing about health foods and blah, 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 you realize it was chlorophyll. It was chlorophyll from that plant that she was giving me.
Was that the moringa plant?
It wasn't moringa. It was called leaf of life. And, because I was asthmatic as a child, if I coughed, if I had a cold, she would always have something ready for me to take. She was absolutely, I would love to have taken more knowledge from her had I known at that point,
Well,
that she was going to pass away and go with all the knowledge and I would need it later on.
How long would she be in your life for?
She was alive for a good portion of my life. I think she didn't pass away till I was in my early 20s. I think I actually had graduated college at the time she passed away. But I didn't see a lot of her because I migrated to America to join my mother, a few years after she left. So,
Right.
and I didn't live with my grandmother. You know, we spent time with her. My mother, particularly before she left, we spent more time with my grandmother before my mother migrated. But then after she migrated, I didn't have those periods of time with her like I did before. I would go and visit her, and then we once I came to America with my mother, we would go back and forth every year or every other year to visit her. But those were always short visits.
So when you actually
But she lived. She lived. She lived quite long. I don't recall how old she was when she passed away.
was your mother able to make it back to the funeral? Make it for
Yes,
the
my
funeral?
mother did. My mother
Okay.
did.
But you weren't able to come?
No, I didn't go.
All right, so let's talk a little bit more about your dad while all of this is going on.
Absentee.
Okay, but so let's go back a little bit further because he had to be present at some point or you wouldn't be here. So.
Obviously. But as a father, I would just chalk him up as an absentee dad because, yeah, he was never really a part of my life.
So, but
Too much later.
let's go back a little bit. So, the part of your life that he's actually in, let's talk a little bit about that. How does he become? Well, we know how he becomes your father, but let's talk a little bit about that relationship. How he meets your mother. What happened there?
Well, so I explained that my father married this lady, and he had a nice home. He
Your father married. Okay.
my grandfather.
Okay,
My grandfather's what I'm talking about now. And so this lady she came from, I guess what you would understand better as the village. She
Correct.
came from the country parts, she wasn't from the city.
Okay.
But however, let me just backtrack. She also had migrated to Cuba. So
did she know? They know
she
of
knew
each
him,
other
she
from
knew him
then?
in
Okay.
Cuba. She knew him in Cuba. So coming back, having traveled out, and now she's married and she has this home in Kingston, and her family members in the country sort of all looked up to her. She was like the success story.
Right.
And so when their children became of age and they wanted them to get a good education, and they wanted them, they were sent to Kingston to go to school, and they would lodge with her.
Okay.
He was one of those.
So he was related to your father. How?
No, he was not related to
your
my
father. Was not related
at
to your
all.
grandfather. He was
He's
related
related
to his wife.
to his wife. Right.
Huh. Okay.
He is the nephew of his wife.
Okay. So while he's living at the house,
He's living at the house with his aunt and her husband. He comes to town to go to school, and he is now lodging with his aunt and her husband in their house, who happens to have a daughter who is living in the same house, which is my mother.
Right. Okay.
They went to high school together. A friendship was struck up, and they're living together.
So how long did it take for how long did it take for you to come along?
I'm not. I'm not sure of the time period, and
But it was
whatever
basically
with
like
them.
a high school thing.
Yeah.
Okay. And how old was your mother when she had you?
She was 20 years old.
In high school?
No, she She was finished high
Oh.
school by that time. But you know, it's like how in Gambia you have A levels and O levels and so on and so forth.
The old
So
British
she,
system.
yes, the old British system. So she had finished her O levels, I think it was, and she was studying to do her A levels. Yeah, I think they both were.
Okay. So now that this is Jamaica and this is 1952, I'm assuming it's pretty traditional.
Very.
So traditionally people would say, hey, well, if you're having a kid, then you have to get married. So what happened to that situation? Because where was your grandfather and all? What was his saying in this conversation?
Well, by this time, my grandfather was very ill. And I don't hear a lot of what my grandfather had to say. My mother's father had to say. My father tells me he was a very quiet man. He was a thoughtful person. He was a thoughtful man, and I don't know. He doesn't give me any details of the interaction, and nor does my mother of my father. All I realized at that point, he was not well. He was sick, and he died.
Well, would you get?
I think he died that August, if I remember correctly, and I was born in December.
So he passed before you were even born. Okay, so it wasn't like he had much.
No.
Or yeah, he wasn't. Okay, that would make. Yeah, because I would imagine that he would have something to say if he were around. That he would be. He'd be like, well, this thing, you'd have him taking the responsibility.
I think it was approached. I don't know if it was by him, but probably by that family member that I said came to live with us afterwards, to live in the house afterwards, which is Pinky's father. Because they were close. Those family members knew the dynamics of the household, and they knew both my mother and my father, and then they liked them both as kids. So they were in a position to sort of sit at the table and say something. But they're in town, and they're aware of what's transpiring there. The family in the country, or the village, as you might understand better, they're not so. And from what I gather, my father's father was quite adamant. This is his oldest son. He's not quite finished school, and this is not going to happen. And there were some other things going on at the time.
As far as the marrying and him taking that kind of responsibility.
So now it's more of a denial.
So now he's saying. So
no, he is not. He's not saying that. I think his family is denying. I mean, how they can deny and how he cannot. But then that's another story for another day.
Well, I mean, this is the story, and it is a day. So.
No, not right now. Not right now. But suffice it to say, his family, and I don't know if it was everybody, because some uncles tell me other things in private, but I know the father opposed it.
Whatever happened to your stepmother?
Okay, so I leave. No, my mom leaves, and I am torn because I want to stay with her.
With your stepmother?
I do. I do. Because this is my home. This is the only home I've ever known.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to go anywhere else. I don't want to be with anybody. I don't even want to go to my grandmother's house to live. I want to stay in my house.
That would make sense. You have all your
Everything is there.
siblings
That's my
and
life. But
stuff.
unfortunately, she suffers from epilepsy. Now we have a whole bunch of stories around that. But I clearly remember this was a very frightening experience for me. Whenever she had them, I was always afraid because I didn't know. She would fall down and I would ask, is she gonna die? What's gonna happen? And one time, she fell with me in her arms. So it was not something that,
So
you know.
couldn't stay even if you wanted to.
Yeah, that's what my mother explained to me. I can't stay because she's gonna get sick and it will be just me and her alone. And I said, but now she's all alone. Who's gonna stay with her when she gets sick? Oh, it was terrible. It was terrible. And so I would go to school, and on the days that she would always tell me to come. It's a little bit like Gambia, where you have certain dishes on certain days, and she would say, you know, I'm going to cook so and so for you on Friday. You come on Friday to get it, okay? You have to come on Friday. So I would have to leave school, go over to her, and like I said, we're worlds apart now, because the place I'm now staying is close to where my grandmother is, on the side of town.
Who were you
My
staying
grandmother
with
is.
at this point?
I'm staying in Whitfield Town, which is close enough to my grandmother's house so that you can take a bus from my grandmother's house to there. But it's on that side of the city. And I'd have to go from school to Rollington Town, which is where we lived, and then from there get to back over on the other side. So it was hard for me. And now you look at my age. Okay, I'm in elementary school. I'm not like in high school or junior high school or anything like that. I'm in elementary school, and I'm traversing the city like this. And I had never traversed the city by myself before, even though I know how to do it, you know?
Right.
So now I would go and visit her, and she would always have my food for me and my treats for me, and can't I stay and spend the night? And that's the part I dreaded. I dreaded because that's when she usually had her seizures during the night. And it was always very scary for me as a child. Very scary.
How long would she last with the epilepsy?
I don't know.
But you would leave before she passed?
Long before she passed. So
Okay, so she dealt with that for a couple of years.
she continued to host the people from her place in the house. So my mother's gone, I'm gone, and she's alone. So her brother now says, well, you know, somebody should come and stay with her permanently. So there were a parade of her family members coming through and going, and you know, but I guess there was somebody who stayed with her for the most part. So about a year ago, I finally heard the story as to what happened. Because I often wonder, my cousin Carlos, on my father's side of the family, he was among those people who always reached out to me and my mother as family. And you know, he insisted. He had come up to the house from the country, and on my days when I would go after school, I met him. That's how I first met him. And we talked and talked and talked. He would tell me various things, and at the end of the day, he was the individual who was most instrumental in me reestablishing a relationship with my father. He just, and I guess, you know, as I said, there were always those family members, his brothers and uncles, and this was his uncle who always felt this way, and this was his uncle's son.
Gotcha. Yeah.
You know. And so he persisted, and he passed away. Carlos passed away.
I thought he lived in Canada.
He did. He passed away in Canada. It's probably coming up in 2 years, 3 years now.
Okay, so this is...
Yes. And it was a younger brother of his who lives in Florida. We were having a conversation about that. After Carlos passed away, he reached out to me, and we started talking a bit more. And I asked him, whatever happened to the house and the contents of the house? And I got the full story from him.
So what happened to the house?
She got so ill, they didn't know what to do. So Carlos's father, which is her brother, came up to town and took her home to his place in the country, where, you know, and that is where she passed away, living with him. So the house was sold. He and another brother of his sold the house, and I guess they took whatever contents of the house that they wanted, and
so
they sold the house. And I didn't bother to ask where the proceeds were. I'm sure the brother took it and probably took care of her with it, and you know, whatever. It's totally irrelevant, but it's just interesting to see how you never know. Once you die, my grandfather felt or thought in his life that this was what my mother would inherit, and he had left her something to continue, you know, the generational wealth. She had something to start off her life with. Unbeknownst to him, it goes not to my mother, but to the family of his wife, who, if you were to ask him, I'm sure these are probably the last people he wanted to end up with his hard-earned, you know. But that's life. That's life.
So he worked to keep it from one generation to another, and then
it ends up just going.
Be careful who you marry.
Yeah, they sold the house, and my mother never looked back. Once she left, she never looked back. I don't even think she ever went back to the house to even see anything of it. But yeah.
Whatever happened to your stepmother?
Okay, so I leave. No, my mom leaves, and I am torn because I want to stay with her.
With your stepmother?
I do. Because this is my home. This is the only home I've ever known. I don't want to go anywhere else. I don't want to be with anybody. I don't even want to go to my grandmother's house to live. I want to stay in my house.
That would make sense. You have all of your
everything is there. That's my life. But unfortunately, she suffers from epilepsy. Now we have a whole bunch of stories around that. But I clearly remember this was a very frightening experience for me. Whenever she had them, I was always afraid because I didn't know. She would fall down, and I would ask, is she gonna die? What's gonna happen? And one time, she fell with me in her arms. So it was not something that,
So you couldn't stay even if you wanted to.
yeah, that's what my mother explained to me. I can't stay because she's gonna get sick, and it will be just me and her alone. And I said, but now she's all alone. Who's gonna stay with her when she gets sick? Oh, it was terrible. It was terrible. And so I would, oh man, I would go to school, and on the days that she would always tell me to come. It's a little bit like Gambia, where you had certain dishes on certain days, and she would say, you know, I'm going to cook so and so for you on Friday. You come on Friday to get it, okay? You have to come on Friday. So I would have to leave school, go over to her, and like I said, we're worlds apart now, because the place I'm now staying is close to where my grandmother is, on the side of town.
Who were you staying with at this point?
I'm staying in Whitfield Town, which is close enough to my grandmother's house so that you can take a bus from my grandmother's house to there. Yeah, but it's on that side of the city. And I'd have to go from school to Rollington Town, which is where we lived, and then from there get to back over on the other side. So it was hard for me. And now you look at my age. Okay, I'm in elementary school. I'm not like in high school or junior high school or anything like that. I'm in elementary school, and I'm traversing the city like this. And I had never traversed the city by myself before, even though I know how to do it, you know?
Right.
So now I would go and visit her, and she would always have my food for me and my treats for me, and can't I stay and spend the night? And that's the part I dreaded. I dreaded because that's when she usually had her seizures during the night. And it was always very scary for me as a child. Very scary.
How long would she last with the epilepsy?
I don't know.
But you would leave before she passed?
Long, long before she passed. So
okay, so she dealt with that for a couple of years.
She continued to host the people from her place in the house. So my mother's gone, I'm gone, and she's alone. So her brother now says, well, you know, somebody should come and stay with her permanently. So there were a parade of her family members coming through and going, and you know, but I guess there was somebody who stayed with her for the most part. So about a year ago, I finally heard the story as to what happened. Because I often wonder, my cousin Carlos, on my father's side of the family, he was among those people who always reached out to me and my mother as family. And you know, he insisted. He had come up to the house from the country, and on my days when I would go after school, I met him. That's how I first met him. And we talked and talked and talked, and he would tell me various things, and of the day, he was the individual who was most instrumental in me reestablishing a relationship with my father.
Mm.
He just, and I guess, as I said, there were always those family members, his brothers and uncles, and this was his uncle who always felt this way, and this was his uncle's son.
Gotcha. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so he persisted, and he passed away.
Carla or Carlos?
Carlos passed away.
I thought he lived in Canada.
He did. He passed away in Canada. It's probably coming up in 3 years now.
Okay. So this is.
Yes. And it was a younger brother of his who lives in Florida. We were having a conversation about that. After Carlos passed away, he reached out to me and we started talking a bit more. And I asked him, whatever happened to the house and the contents of the house? And I got the full story from him.
So what happened to the house?
She got so ill, they didn't know what to do. So Carlos's father, which is her brother, came up to town and took her home to his place in the country, and that is where she passed away, living with him. So the house was sold. He and another brother of his sold the house, and I guess they took whatever contents of the house that they wanted, and
so
they sold the house. And I didn't bother to ask where the proceeds were. I'm sure the brother took it and probably took care of her with it, and whatever. It's totally irrelevant, but it's just interesting to see how you never know. Once you die, my grandfather felt or thought in his life that this was what my mother would inherit, and he had left her something to continue. The generational wealth. She has something to start off her life with. Unbeknownst to him, it goes not to my mother, but to the family of his wife, who, if you were to ask him, I'm sure these are probably the last people he wanted to end up with his hard-earned, But that's life.
So he worked to keep it from one generation to another, and then
it ends up just going.
Be careful who you marry.
Yeah, they sold the house, and my mother never looked back. Once she left, she never looked back. I don't even think she ever went back to the house to even see anything of it. But yeah. I'm thinking perhaps maybe 6.
Okay.
I might have been about 6 years old, 5, 6 years old when they come along. So these people are my father's cousin, Arnold Davis. He marries Louise English. We will later come to know her as Aunt Louise of Brooklyn, New York.
Right.
And they have 4 children. They have Jean, the oldest child, a girl, Ray, the oldest son, and Paulette, who we call Pinky, and Janet, which we know as Marella. So that family moves into the portion of the house that my family is no longer using because it's just them. My mother, my grandfather has passed away, and so they've sort of downsized, and they're renting out portions of the house. I guess this is going to be income to sustain them. this was lovely for me because now there was somebody right there for me to play with. And I don't remember a time when, the period of time when they weren't there, I don't really remember it.
Mm-hmm.
I remember them always living there. And so there, we were all very young, and my interaction with them was after school and on weekends, particularly on Sundays, because we went to church together on Sundays. The two oldest were responsible for the rest of us, the three younger ones.
It's always a recipe for disaster.
No, it wasn't a recipe for disaster because they were very, very responsible. Even when we wanted to take a shortcut to walk, because we walked to church, we didn't have buses, and very few people had cars, and so on. And that was always a treat. It was always an interesting time. I guess I was a sort of kind of delicate little child, and I remember clearly having someone in my class at Sunday school pick on me and just teasing me. I don't even remember what they were teasing me about, but I remember mentioning it to my cousin Pinky. Somehow or another this came up, and it was at that early age I realized who this young lady would be. And she actually fought this child after Sunday school. Which you don't come out of Sunday school and start beating up people. But she said, "You don't mess with my cousin ever." And the girl got a whipping, and I never had any more problems with that girl in Sunday school. So that was a good recollection of her. And when we had picnics, the church would always have an annual picnic. And she was just Pinky. She was the fastest runner. And she would always win the races. So we would have these races where you could run with somebody. I don't know if it was sack races or whatever. And she would always try to get me to come along, and she would be dragging me along to run with her. And I just said, I can't keep up with her. But she was always fast, and she would get the prize. Later on, I also, would run and get a couple prizes myself. But those were my memories of her in church. And she was just, she was an interesting character.
Did you all go to school together?
No, we didn't go to school.
Different schools, but your friend lived in the same house. I mean, I would assume.
Because the schools do not. So, the kindergarten, at that age, it's not here where you have a centralized school and this school is for this area, and the schools were private. Miss so and so would have her school over here, Miss so and so would have her school over here, and if you knew the family, or somebody recommended them, or the house, so that's how you chose where you went to school. So I guess I would call this my kindergarten years. I went to a small school. It was just maybe about 3 or 4 blocks from my house, and neither one of them, I guess, Morella would have been too young to go to school. And when I was there, Pinky was in elementary school, because she's a bit older than I am. So I went there by myself. And that was a lovely time as well.
Did you make any friends over there? Notoriety that you remember?
I had friends, but I don't remember. I have a teacher who I remember very well. And I remember one, you would always have
Hold that thought.
closing out ceremonies.
Hold that thought. Hamza, turn that off for me, please. Real quick. Run. Stop the alarm. It'd be one thing if it was calling it at the right time.
You would have closing out ceremonies at the end of school, and the children would recite poems or sing a song. They would put on a little program, and I remember.
Go back to closing out programs.
Yes, we would have closing out programs at the end of the school year, and I remember 2 years that I participated. Maybe I only went to the school for 2 years actually. But I remember participating in those closing out activities and having to memorize my poem and getting up on the stage in my white dress and my white patent leather shoes and my big white bow in my hair. Ask me the poem, I don't remember. But those were vivid memories. And you would always have sandwiches and finger foods and things of that nature afterwards. And you get a little prize, because you did so well in school and whatever have you. And I always got really good recommendations from the teachers. So I left there, and then I began elementary school, which I went to an all-girls elementary school, the same one that my mother went to.
Well, that had to be rough.
Hmm?
So that had to be rough. Like everyone knew your mother now knows you. How many teachers were there from that taught your mother that taught you?
It wasn't rough. It was good because everyone either was in school with my mother and knew her, or taught my mother. So you can see the difference in age. The older teachers had taught my mother. The principal knew my mother, and the younger teachers had gone to school with my mother. So that was an interesting dynamic, and it helped whenever you had incidences in school. So my mother gave me a very nice fountain pen, and she told me to take care of it and not lose it at school. I went to school, and the little girl took my fountain pen, and I said, no, that's not her pen, that's my mother's pen. And you wouldn't believe a pen could have caused such a ruckus in the classroom. But it turned out that in this particular class, it was an older teacher. Her name was Miss Croswell. I never liked her, and her name fitted her. She was always cross. And then, so that's, as little children, that's what we said. That's why her name was Crosswell, because she was always cross. And so she took the pen. She said I wasn't going to have the pen. She didn't give the other girl the pen either, because we were disputing, and I said, okay, fine, I'm going to bring my mother to school. Well, my mother comes to school, and oh, Iris, and yes, yeah. I mean, I don't know how you didn't know that was my mother, but long story short, my mother went home with the pen. No big deal. If there was ever any issue, the first headmistress, Mrs. McPherson, my mother knew her very well, and so you sort of get a little bit of preferential treatment. I remember another very nice teacher. Her name was Miss Peterkin, and she had been a classmate of my mother in school, and I was like her pet student, as they would say. I was the prefect of the class. I did this, I did that. she would allow me to go out, and under the guise of if I wanted to go to the plate, to the, let's say the, I don't even know what you call it now, but they used to sell beef patties at that place, and I wanted to go there, I would ask her, Miss, do you want anything from the, and she would always know that I want to go and get beef patties, and she would always give me an errand to run so I can go there and get it and come back, because we weren't allowed to leave the school premises once we came to school. So the years that my mother was there, everything went really well. I did well in school. After my mother left, things went a little downhill because the lady that I stayed with, she just was not the best. She was not the best person, and it impacted my school life.
So how did your mother break the news to you that she was going to leave? Did it come suddenly? Did you know it?
No.
Did you?
No.
Were you a part of the whole process?
I knew, the whole thing. So the lady who...
Were you excited about it?
Yes. Because the lady who informed my mother about this was our neighbor in the back. So our two homes were together, was divided by a fence in the back. Her granddaughter was the age that I was. That is the person you know as Aunt Joy.
Okay.
It was her grandmother, and her mother had already migrated to Canada. So I was really excited because now my mother was going to go to America. And yes, her grandmother was, she took a liking to my mother as well. And she was always very kind to my mother and to me. And when my mother got her papers and she was free to leave now, she was going, she wanted to leave me with her. But at this point in time, she had 3 other children staying with her because her brother and his wife had left for America, and their children were staying with her. And she had to have a bigger house in order to accommodate me. So
you knew that you were going at some point.
I knew that my mother was going, and I knew that I couldn't stay with her stepmother, and so I had to go and live somewhere else. Yes, I knew once my mother left, she wasn't going to leave me there forever, and she told me that when she went, she was going to, once she gets on her feet, she would send for me. So that was, always in the back of my mind.
So was that an emotional time for? I mean, you mentioned it was happy, but I can't imagine.
No,
that
at this point, my life changes. Once my mother leaves, my life changes.
I'm talking about before she, as she's telling you that this is what's going to happen. I'm guessing.
No,
she's
I'm
cool.
happy. I'm happy for her. I'm sad that she's going to go, but it doesn't really hit me. It doesn't hit me until she's going to the airport. That's when it hit me like a ton of bricks. And now I have to pack up my stuff and move to go to live with somebody else, and I don't know this person I'm going to live with. And that began another chapter in my life. But up until that time, I was happy for my mother. My mother was happy, to have this opportunity. And if she's happy, I'm happy. So, I was happy until I wasn't.